A long time ago, in a rich and peaceful kingdom, there lived a great king who ruled his land with wisdom and kindness. And although he had everything a king could wish for, gold, power, and respect, his greatest treasure was his only daughter, a princess who was known across many lands for her beauty. Yet, sadly, she was also known for her great pride and sharp tongue. For although she was lovely to look at, her heart was cold and her manners were cruel, and the king worried deeply about her future. Believing that marriage might change her ways and soften her heart, so he invited many noble kings, princes, dukes, and earls from far and wide to come to his court and ask for his daughter's hand. But when the day came and the noble men stood proudly before her, the princess did not greet them with kindness or respect. Instead, she laughed at them, mocked their looks, and found cruel names for each one, saying one was too fat, another too thin, one too tall like a maypole, another too short like a dumpling. And with every word she spoke, the king's face grew darker with shame and anger. Yet he remained silent, hoping she would stop, until at last a good and gentle king stepped forward, a man with a strong body and a thick dark beard. And though his eyes were kind and his heart honest, the princess laughed loudly and pointed at him, saying his beard looked like an old mop, and calling him King Grisly Beard. And at this insult, the great king could remain silent no longer, for his daughter had crossed the final line. And in his anger he stood up and declared that she would be married at once to the very first man who entered the palace gate, whether he was noble or poor prince or beggar. And though the princess cried and begged for forgiveness, the king's word was law, and 2 days later, as fate would have it, a poor fiddler came to the palace garden playing his violin and asking for food. And the king ordered the guards to bring him inside, and before the frightened princess could escape, the king announced that she would marry the fiddler. And though the fiddler was shocked, he was also grateful, while the princess wept bitterly. But the wedding was held without delay. And once it was over, the king ordered the newly married couple to leave the palace at once, for the princess would no longer live in comfort and pride. And so the fiddler led his bride away from the palace and into the wide unknown world. And they walked for many long days through forests, across meadows, and past shining cities, and each time they passed a beautiful land. The princess asked who owned it, and the fiddler answered that it belonged to King Grisly Beard. And each time she heard that name, her heart sank, and she whispered sadly that she had been a fool to laugh at such a good king. Yet she said nothing aloud, and at last they reached a small, lonely cottage at the edge of a town. And when the princess saw how tiny and poor it was, she gasped and asked where the servants were. But the fiddler gently told her that there were no servants, and that she must now work with her own hands. And inside the cottage there was little food, and the princess, who had never cooked before, burned the meals and made a mess. And when she tried to weave baskets, as her husband asked, the sharp reeds cut her soft fingers until they bled, and the fiddler scolded her, saying she was useless at everything. And though his words hurt her deeply, they slowly began to break her pride, and seeing her struggle, the fiddler decided to let her sell pots and pans at the market, and because of her beauty, many people came to buy from her, and for a few days she felt hope. But one day a drunk soldier rode through the street and smashed all the pots and pans to pieces. And the princess fell to the ground crying in despair. And when she returned home and told her husband, he said she could not sell goods any more, and that he had found her work as a kitchen maid in the royal palace. And so the princess, once proud and admired, now cleaned floors, ovens, and dirty pots, and though the work was hard and her hands were sore, she accepted it quietly, taking home scraps of food at the end of each day. And one day she heard that a great wedding was to be held in the palace. And as she looked through the window at the bright lights and happy guests, her heart filled with sorrow. And she whispered that if only she had not been so proud, she might have been a queen. And at that moment she was called into the great hall, where all the nobles stood, including her father, and shame burned her face as they laughed at her poor clothes. And then suddenly a noble king stepped forward and spoke kindly to her, revealing that he was the fiddler who had married her, the soldier who had broken her pots, and the man she had once mocked as King Grisly Beard. And he explained that everything he had done was to teach her that pride is the greatest evil and humility the greatest strength. And the princess fell to her knees in tears, begging forgiveness, for her pride was truly gone. And the king lifted her up, took her hand, and married her again in joy and honor. And from that day on, the princess was gentle, wise, and kind, and together they ruled the kingdom in happiness and peace. Having learned that true beauty lives not in pride, but in a humble and loving heart.